The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training base as Sarah Martinez laced up her running shoes for what would become the most challenging day of her career. At 24 years old, she had already proven herself in countless ways during her 2 years of service, but today felt different. The air was thick with anticipation and the unspoken pressure that came with being one of only 3 women in her unit. Sarah had always been smaller than her peers. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 130 pounds, she often felt like a sparrow among eagles. Her fellow soldiers towered over her, their broad shoulders and muscular frames making her appear almost fragile in comparison. But what Sarah lacked in size, she made up for in determination and heart. The training exercise was designed to test every soldier's endurance, strength, and mental fortitude. It consisted of a 10-mile run through rough terrain, followed by various physical challenges that would push each participant to their absolute limits. For weeks, Sarah had prepared religiously, waking up before dawn to run extra miles, and spending her free time in the gym, working on building the strength she knew she would need. As the unit gathered at the starting line, Sarah could feel the familiar weight of doubt settling on her shoulders like an unwelcome companion. Sergeant Williams, a massive man who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds, glanced in her direction with what appeared to be a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed amusement. "Think you can keep up today, Martinez?" he asked with a smirk that made Sarah's jaw tighten with determination. She had heard variations of this question countless times before. Some asked it out of genuine concern, others out of curiosity, but from Sergeant Williams, it always carried an undertone of condescension that made her blood boil. He had never been openly hostile, but his subtle comments and dismissive looks had worn on her patience over the months they had served together. "I'll do my best, Sergeant," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and professional despite the frustration building inside her chest. The other soldiers around them shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension that had become all too familiar between the sergeant and the young woman who refused to be intimidated by his imposing presence. Some of them had grown to respect Sarah's tenacity over the months, but others still viewed her as a liability, someone who would inevitably slow them down when the pressure mounted. The commanding officer's whistle pierced the morning air, and the group took off at a steady pace. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the pack, knowing from experience that starting too fast would leave her struggling later in the run. The first few miles passed without incident, the rhythm of feet against dirt creating a steady cadence that matched her breathing. But as they approached the halfway point, Sarah began to feel the familiar burning sensation in her lungs that warned her she was pushing harder than usual. The pace had gradually increased, and she realized that some of the stronger runners were deliberately trying to stretch out the group, separating the stronger soldiers from those who might struggle to maintain the demanding speed. By mile 6, Sarah was fighting to maintain her position. Her breathing had become labored, and she could feel sweat streaming down her face despite the cool morning air. The gap between her and the lead runners was growing wider with each passing minute, but she refused to give up. She had trained too hard and come too far to let them break her spirit now. Sergeant Williams was running just ahead of her, his powerful strides eating up the ground with an ease that made Sarah's struggle appear even more pronounced. Every few minutes, he would glance back over his shoulder, and Sarah could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he watched her fall further behind the main group. At mile 7, disaster struck. Sarah's left foot caught on a hidden root, and she stumbled forward, her arms windmilling desperately as she fought to regain her balance. For a moment, it seemed like she might recover, but her momentum carried her too far forward, and she crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust and loose gravel. The fall scraped her hands and knees, leaving her palms bloody and her uniform torn. But more devastating than the physical pain was the sound of laughter that erupted from several soldiers who had witnessed her tumble. The harsh, mocking sound cut through the morning air like a knife, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. "Looks like Martinez finally found her limit," one of the soldiers called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "Maybe she should have stayed in the kitchen," another voice added, triggering another round of cruel laughter. Sarah pushed herself up from the ground, her hands stinging from the scrapes, and her pride wounded more deeply than her body. She could see Sergeant Williams had stopped running and was standing about 20 feet ahead, watching the scene unfold with what appeared to be smug satisfaction. He made no move to help her or to silence the soldiers who were openly mocking her struggle. For a moment, Sarah considered staying down. The pain in her hands and knees was nothing compared to the humiliation she felt burning in her chest. Every instinct told her to quit, to accept that she had been beaten, and walk back to base with whatever dignity she could salvage from the situation. But, as she knelt there in the dirt, breathing hard and fighting back tears of frustration, something inside her hardened into steel. She had not come this far and worked this hard to let a group of bullies defeat her. The laughter and cruel comments only served to fuel a fire that had been building inside her for months. Sarah climbed to her feet, brushing the dust from her uniform and ignoring the stinging pain in her scraped palms. She looked directly at Sergeant Williams, meeting his gaze with a determination that surprised even herself. Without saying a word, she began running again, her stride steady despite the setback she had just endured. The laughter died away as the other soldiers realized she was not giving up. Some of them seemed almost disappointed that their attempts to break her spirit had failed, while others watched with a grudging respect that they were not yet ready to openly acknowledge. As Sarah continued running, the gap between her and the lead group continued to widen. Her injured hands made it difficult to maintain proper form, and the emotional toll of the fall and subsequent mockery had drained more of her energy reserves. But she pressed on, driven by a stubbornness that had been forged through years of proving herself in situations where others expected her to fail. The 8th mile passed in a blur of pain and determination. Sarah's world had narrowed to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the growing ache in her legs. She could no longer see the main group ahead of her, but she could hear their voices carrying back on the wind, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen behind. By mile 9, Sarah was running completely alone. The isolation was almost as difficult to bear as the physical pain, but she used it as motivation, imagining the surprise on her tormentors' faces when she crossed the finish line despite everything they had done to break her spirit. As she rounded the final bend before the last mile, Sarah saw something that made her heart sink. Sergeant Williams was sitting on a fallen log beside the trail, apparently waiting for her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his posture that suggested he was not simply resting. "Having trouble keeping up, Martinez?" he asked as she approached, his voice carrying the same condescending tone that had become so familiar to her. Sarah slowed to a stop, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. She had hoped to finish the run without any further confrontation, but it seemed that Sergeant Williams was not content to let her complete the exercise without one final attempt to prove his point about her inadequacy. "I'm fine, Sergeant," she managed to say between gasps for air. "Just taking it one step at a time." Williams stood up from the log, his massive frame blocking much of the trail ahead. "You know, Martinez, there's no shame in admitting when you're beaten. Sometimes the smart thing to do is to recognize your limitations and accept them." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but instead of breaking her spirit, they only strengthened her resolve. She had heard variations of this speech too many times before, from too many people who had tried to convince her that she did not belong in situations that required strength and endurance. "With all due respect, Sergeant, I'm not beaten until I quit," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger despite her exhaustion. "And I'm not quitting." Williams shook his head with what appeared to be genuine frustration. "This isn't about pride, Martinez. This is about reality. You're holding everyone back, and sooner or later, that's going to get someone hurt in a real situation." Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, a tension that had been building for months finally, reaching its breaking point. She had endured the condescending comments, the skeptical looks, and the constant pressure to prove herself worthy of respect. But she would not stand there and listen to someone suggest that her presence made her fellow soldiers less safe. "Then, I guess I'll have to prove you wrong, Sergeant," she said, stepping around him and resuming her run toward the finish line. Behind her, She heard Williams call out something else, but she was no longer listening. Her focus had narrowed to the single goal of completing the run and showing everyone who had doubted her that she possessed the strength and determination to overcome any obstacle they put in her path. The final mile stretched ahead of her like a promise of redemption, and Sarah was determined to claim it. Sarah's legs felt like lead as she entered the final mile, but her spirit had never been stronger. Each step forward was an act of defiance against everyone who had tried to convince her she did not belong. The finish line was somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the next hill, and she was determined to reach it no matter what obstacles remained in her path. As she crested the hill, Sarah could see the training area spread out below her. The main group had already finished their run and was gathered around the various physical challenge stations that would complete the day's exercise. She could make out their figures moving through different tasks, their movements crisp and efficient after having had time to recover from the 10-mile run. The sight of them already engaged in the next phase of training sent a fresh wave of determination through Sarah's tired body. She had lost significant ground during her fall and the confrontation with Sergeant Williams, but the exercise was far from over. If she could push herself through the remaining distance and tackle the physical challenges with the same tenacity she had shown during the run, she might still prove her doubters wrong. Sarah picked up her pace as much as her exhausted legs would allow, her breathing harsh and labored in the thin morning air. The scrapes on her hands had stopped bleeding, but they stung with each swing of her arms. Her uniform was dirty and torn from the fall, making her look even more battered than she felt. As she approached the training area, Sarah could see some of the soldiers pointing in her direction and talking among themselves. The mockery from earlier had given way to a mixture of curiosity and grudging acknowledgement that she had not given up as they had expected. A few of them even looked slightly ashamed of their earlier behavior, though none would meet her eyes directly. Lieutenant Commander Johnson, the officer overseeing the training exercise, checked his watch as Sarah stumbled across the finish line. She was nearly 15 minutes behind the main group, a significant gap that would normally result in additional disciplinary training. But something in her determined expression and battered appearance seemed to give him pause. "Nice work finishing the run, Martinez," he said, his voice neutral but not unkind. "Take 5 minutes to catch your breath. Then, report to Station 1 for the strength assessment." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak without gasping for air. She found a patch of shade near the edge of the training area and sank down onto the ground, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Around her, the other soldiers continued their rotation through the various challenge stations, their movements a constant reminder of how much ground she still needed to make up. The strength assessment station consisted of several different tests designed to evaluate each soldier's ability to handle the physical demands of combat situations. There were rope climbs, weighted carries, obstacle courses, and various lifting challenges that would push everyone to their limits regardless of their current fitness level. As Sarah watched the other soldiers move through the exercises, she began to feel a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The running portion had been difficult enough, but these challenges would require the kind of raw physical strength where her smaller size would be an even greater disadvantage. Sergeant Williams was currently at the weighted carry station, effortlessly hoisting a heavy pack onto his shoulders and jogging across the designated course. His movements were smooth and confident, a stark contrast to the struggle that Sarah knew she would face when her turn came to attempt the same task. "Martinez, you're up," Lieutenant Commander Johnson called out, interrupting her worried observations. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her legs still shaky from the run, but her resolve as strong as ever. She walked over to the first station, where a thick rope hung from a wooden beam about 20 feet above the ground. The challenge was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. Climb to the top and ring the bell, then descend in a controlled manner without falling. Several soldiers had already completed this challenge, their chalk-covered hands testament to the grip strength required to make it to the top. Sarah rubbed her scraped palms together, wincing slightly at the pain, but knowing she had no choice but to push through it. She grasped the rope with both hands, feeling the rough fibers bite into her torn skin. The pain was immediate and sharp, but She forced herself to focus on the technique she had practiced countless times in preparation for this day. Hand over hand, she began to pull herself up, her legs wrapped around the rope to provide additional support. The first few feet were manageable, but as she climbed higher, the rope seemed to grow heavier and more difficult to grip. Sarah's arms began to shake with the effort, and she could feel her hands starting to slip despite her best efforts to maintain her hold. Around the base of the rope, several soldiers had gathered to watch her attempt. Some were openly betting on whether she would make it to the top, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. The pressure of their scrutiny made the challenge even more difficult, but Sarah refused to let their expectations affect her performance. Halfway up the rope, Sarah's progress slowed significantly. The combination of fatigue from the run and the pain in her hands was making each upward movement a monumental effort. Her breathing had become ragged again, and she could feel sweat dripping into her eyes despite the cool temperature. "Come on, Martinez, you're not going to quit now, are you?" One of the soldiers called out from below, his tone suggesting that he expected exactly that outcome. The comment sparked a fresh surge of anger that gave Sarah the energy she needed to continue climbing. She gritted her teeth and hauled herself up another few feet, her muscles screaming in protest, but her will absolutely unbroken. With a final desperate effort, Sarah's hand closed around the bell at the top of the rope. The clear, sharp sound it made when she rang it was one of the sweetest sounds she had ever heard. For a moment, she hung there savoring the accomplishment, looking down at the faces of the soldiers below who had expected her to fail. The descent was almost as challenging as the climb, requiring controlled movements to avoid falling and injuring herself. Sarah's arms were shaking so badly by the time she reached the ground that she could barely maintain her grip, but she made it down safely and stepped away from the rope with a sense of pride that eclipsed her physical exhaustion. "Well done," Lieutenant Commander Johnson said as he marked something on his clipboard. "Move on to Station 2 when you're ready." The second station involved carrying a weighted pack across a designated course that included several obstacles. The pack weighed 60 pounds, nearly half of Sarah's own body weight, and the course was designed to test not just strength but also balance and endurance under load. Sarah strapped the pack onto her shoulders, immediately feeling the weight settle across her back like a crushing burden. The straps cut into her shoulders, and she had to adjust her posture significantly to maintain her balance under the heavy load. The course began with a series of wooden barriers that had to be climbed over while wearing the pack. Sarah approached the first obstacle slowly, knowing that any mistake could result in a fall that might injure her or damage the equipment. The extra weight made every movement awkward and difficult, but she managed to haul herself over the barrier and continue toward the next challenge. A low crawl under a net came next, followed by a balance beam that had to be crossed without stepping off. Each obstacle tested a different aspect of her physical capabilities, while the heavy pack made everything exponentially more difficult. As Sarah worked her way through the course, she became aware that Sergeant Williams was now watching her progress. He had finished his own rotation through the stations and was standing with his arms crossed, observing her struggle with what appeared to be professional interest rather than the mockery she had expected. The final obstacle was a rope bridge that spanned a muddy pit. The bridge swayed and bounced with each step, made even more unstable by the weight of the pack Sarah was carrying. She moved carefully across the swaying surface, her arms extended for balance as she fought to maintain her footing on the narrow wooden planks. Halfway across the bridge, disaster struck again. Sarah's foot slipped on a wet plank, and she felt herself beginning to fall toward the muddy pit below. The weight of the pack pulled her backward, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she was going to crash down into the mud and fail the challenge completely. But somehow, she managed to grab one of the guide ropes with her free hand, arresting her fall just inches above the mud. Hanging there with the full weight of the pack trying to drag her down, Sarah summoned every ounce of strength she had left and pulled herself back up onto the bridge. The effort left her gasping and shaking, but she had not fallen. Step by careful step, she made her way across the remaining distance and, finally, stepped onto solid ground on the other side of the pit. "Time," Lieutenant Commander Johnson called out, checking his stopwatch. Sarah had completed the course well within the required time frame, despite the setbacks and struggles she had faced along the way. As she unstrapped the heavy pack and set it down with relief, Sarah realized that several soldiers were now watching her with expressions that had shifted from mockery to something closer to respect. She had not been the fastest or the strongest, but she had refused to quit when things became difficult, and that persistence was beginning to earn recognition from her peers. But the day's challenges were far from over. The final station would test lifting and carrying abilities in a scenario designed to simulate battlefield conditions. Sarah knew this would be her greatest test yet, the place where her smaller size would be the most significant disadvantage. As she approached the final station, Sarah caught sight of Sergeant Williams again. He was no longer watching with detached interest, but seemed to be studying her with a new kind of attention. Something in his expression had changed, though she could not quite interpret what that change meant. Little did Sarah know that the events of the next few minutes would transform not only how others saw her, but how she understood her own capabilities and the true meaning of strength in the face of adversity. The final test was about to begin, and it would prove more challenging and more revealing than anything she had faced so far. The final station looked deceptively simple from a distance, but Sarah could see the complexity in the details as she approached. The challenge was designed to simulate a battlefield rescue scenario, where soldiers would need to move an injured comrade to safety under pressure. Various weighted dummies were positioned around the area, each representing different body weights and sizes that might need to be carried or dragged to safety. Lieutenant Commander Johnson was explaining the exercise to a small group of soldiers who had gathered for the final rotation. "This is about more than just strength," he was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen real combat situations. "In the field, you might need to move someone who is unconscious, wounded, or unable to help themselves. Size and technique matter, but heart and determination matter more." Sarah listened carefully to the instructions, her mind already working through the physics of the challenge ahead. She had studied different carrying techniques in her training manuals, knowing that her smaller size would require her to be smarter rather than stronger when it came to moving heavy loads. The first part of the exercise required each soldier to lift and carry a 150-pound dummy across a 50-yard course. The path included several obstacles designed to simulate the chaos and difficulty of a real battlefield, including barriers to climb over and uneven terrain that would test balance and endurance under load. Sarah watched as the soldiers ahead of her completed the challenge with varying degrees of success. The largest and strongest men made it look almost easy, hoisting the dummies onto their shoulders and jogging across the course with minimal apparent effort. Others struggled more visibly, but still managed to complete the task within the allotted time frame. When her turn came, Sarah approached the dummy with a mixture of determination and apprehension. At 150 pounds, it weighed more than she did, and she knew that traditional lifting techniques might not work for someone of her size and build. She knelt beside the dummy and worked her arms underneath it, trying to find the best grip and leverage point. The dead weight was immediately challenging, offering none of the cooperation she might expect from a conscious person who could help support their own weight. After a moment of adjustment, Sarah managed to get the dummy positioned across her shoulders in a fireman's carry. The weight was enormous, pressing down on her shoulders and back with what felt like crushing force. Her legs shook with the effort of standing up, but somehow she managed to rise to her feet and take her first steps toward the course. The first few yards were manageable, but Sarah quickly realized that carrying this much weight over any significant distance was going to be nearly impossible with conventional methods. Her breathing became labored almost immediately, and she could feel her legs beginning to give way under the excessive load. Instead of trying to power through with brute strength she did not possess, Sarah stopped and carefully lowered the dummy to the ground. Around her, she could hear murmurs from the watching soldiers, some of whom seemed to think she was giving up on the challenge. But Sarah was not quitting. She was thinking. She had studied enough anatomy and physics to understand that there were different ways to move heavy objects efficiently. Instead of trying to carry the dummy, she repositioned herself and began to drag it using a technique that distributed the weight more effectively and allowed her to use her leg muscles rather than relying solely on her back and shoulders. The dragging method was slower than carrying, but it was sustainable in a way that the fireman's carry had not been. Sarah made steady progress across the course, navigating the obstacles with careful planning and determination rather than raw power. "That's not the standard technique, Martinez," Sergeant Williams called out as she passed the halfway point. His voice carried a note of criticism, but there was something else in it too, something that might have been grudging respect. "It's getting the job done, Sergeant," Sarah replied without breaking her rhythm. She was breathing hard from the effort, but she was not stopping or slowing down significantly. When she finally completed the course, Sarah was exhausted but triumphant. She had proven that technique and determination could overcome limitations in raw strength. The dummy had reached the finish line safely, which was the ultimate objective of the exercise. Lieutenant Commander Johnson checked his stopwatch and made a note on his clipboard. "Acceptable time and successful completion," he announced. "Creative adaptation of technique under challenging circumstances." The acknowledgement felt like a victory, but Sarah barely had time to savor it before the next phase of the challenge began. This part of the exercise was designed to test soldiers under unexpected pressure, simulating the chaos and unpredictability of real combat situations. Without warning, Lieutenant Commander Johnson pointed at Sergeant Williams and shouted, "Man down. Sergeant Williams has been hit and needs immediate evacuation." Sarah looked around in confusion as Sergeant Williams suddenly collapsed to the ground, playing his part in the simulation perfectly. His massive frame lay motionless in the dirt, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was the closest soldier to him. According to the rules of the exercise, it was her responsibility to get him to safety. The weight difference between the training dummy and Sergeant Williams was significant. Where the dummy had weighed 150 pounds, Sergeant Williams was closer to 200 pounds of solid muscle. The prospect of moving him seemed absolutely impossible given Sarah's size and the exhaustion she was already feeling from the previous challenges. Around her, the other soldiers watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This was the moment many of them had been waiting for, the situation where Sarah's limitations would finally prove insurmountable. The irony was not lost on anyone that the very man who had mocked her earlier was now depending on her for rescue. Sarah knelt beside Sergeant Williams, her mind racing through the possibilities. Every traditional carrying technique she knew would be inadequate for moving someone of his size and weight. But the exercise was not about tradition. It was about getting a wounded comrade to safety by any means necessary. "Come on, Martinez, we don't have all day," Lieutenant Commander Johnson barked, adding pressure to an already intense situation. In a real scenario, delay could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would surprise everyone watching, including herself. Instead of attempting to lift Sergeant Williams, she positioned herself at his head and grabbed him under the arms. Using a technique she had read about but never attempted with such a heavy load, she began to drag him backward toward the safe zone. The key was leverage and body positioning. By keeping her center of gravity low and using her entire body rather than just her arms, Sarah was able to generate enough force to move the sergeant's considerable weight. It was not graceful or fast, but it was effective. The first few feet were the hardest as Sarah figured out the optimal technique and rhythm. Sergeant Williams was completely limp, offering no assistance as she struggled to generate momentum and maintain her grip on his uniform. Her feet slipped in the dirt as she fought for traction, and sweat poured down her face from the incredible effort. But gradually, she began to make progress. Foot by foot, yard by yard, Sarah dragged Sergeant Williams across the rough terrain toward the designated safe zone. Her breathing became ragged and desperate, but she refused to stop or ask for help from the other soldiers who were watching in growing amazement. The most challenging part came when they reached an obstacle that Sarah had to navigate while continuing to move the sergeant. A low barrier blocked their path, too high to drag him over, but too solid to go around. Sarah paused for a moment, assessing the situation and trying to figure out how to overcome this latest challenge. With a grunt of effort, she managed to lift Sergeant Williams's upper body and shoulders high enough to clear the barrier. then scrambled over herself and pulled his legs through. The maneuver was awkward and exhausting, but it worked. As they approached the safe zone, Sarah's strength was nearly depleted. Her legs shook with each step, and her arms felt like they were on fire from the constant strain of maintaining her grip on the sergeant's uniform. But the finish line was only yards away, and she was determined to complete the rescue no matter what it cost her. With a final surge of effort fueled by pure determination, Sarah dragged Sergeant Williams across the line, marking the safe zone. The moment his feet crossed the boundary, she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air and shaking from the enormous effort she had just expended. The silence that followed was absolute. Every soldier in the training area was staring at Sarah with expressions of shock and disbelief. They had just witnessed something that defied their expectations and challenged their assumptions about what was possible. Sergeant Williams slowly sat up, his role in the simulation completed. For a long moment, he stared at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The mockery and condescension were gone, replaced by something that looked very much like respect. "That was," he began, then stopped, apparently struggling to find the right words. Lieutenant Commander Johnson stepped forward, his own expression showing clear admiration for what he had just witnessed. "Outstanding work, Martinez," he said, his voice carrying genuine praise. "You just demonstrated that heart and determination can overcome any physical limitation." Around them, the other soldiers began to murmur among themselves, their conversations filled with new assessments of the woman they had underestimated so completely. Some looked ashamed of their earlier mockery, while others seemed genuinely inspired by what they had seen. Sarah slowly pushed herself to her feet, her legs still unsteady but her spirit soaring. She looked down at Sergeant Williams, who was brushing dirt from his uniform and regarding her with an expression of newfound respect. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any elaborate apology could have conveyed. Sarah nodded, too exhausted for extended conversation, but understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. The challenge that had begun with mockery and doubt had ended with a demonstration of strength that went far beyond what any scale could measure. As the training exercise concluded and the soldiers began to disperse, Sarah reflected on the events of the day. She had been mocked for her stumble during the run, dismissed as too weak to complete the challenges, and expected to fail when faced with an impossible rescue scenario. But she had proven that strength comes in many forms, and that determination and heart can accomplish things that raw power alone never could. The 200-pound sergeant she had dragged to safety would never again question her place in the unit, and neither would anyone else who had witnessed her performance. The scars on her hands would heal, and her torn uniform could be replaced. But the lesson learned that day about the true nature of strength would stay with everyone who had been present. Sarah Martinez had shown them all that heroes come in every size, and that the will to never give up is the most powerful force of all. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of Sarah's rescue would become legend within the unit. New recruits would hear about the day a small woman dragged a massive sergeant to safety, proving that courage and determination matter more than size or strength. And Sarah herself would continue to serve with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing she had been tested in the crucible and emerged victorious. The mockery had been silenced forever, replaced by the kind of respect that can only be earned through actions that speak louder than any words ever could. Sarah Martinez had found her place among warriors, not by being the biggest or the strongest, but by being the one who refused to quit when quitting would have been the easy choice.